So I'm Greg Rogers. I live in East Asheville. I've been beekeeping for 42 or 43 years now. I actually started in this county, in Henderson County. I got my one little first beehive, a package of bees from Keenum's Bee Supply, which probably no one in here has ever even heard of. He was out on Willow Road off Cayuga, and he was an older gentleman and had a small bee supply business. And I started back in 82 or 83, I think, with my first package of bees. And so I lived in Henderson County for about 6 years, so I have a lot of roots here in Henderson County too. But anyway, so we'll get to this, and so I have about 350 hives now. I've had over 400 at one point, but starting to go down a little bit, starting to hit the age where I'm downsizing a bit. And so what we're going to talk about today, this is the third year, actually the fourth year of playing with this whole idea of how to treat bees and treat varroa mites. So some of this is going to be repetitive. Some of it's from the same talk. Many of you have probably seen it at another bee meeting or on YouTube with Bob. But I want to go through some of the old slides just to kind of review how we got to this year, and then finally I'll get to this year's data, which will be interesting, and I'll have both my data and Bob's data. And this will be fun because Bob's here and we can kind of compare it. This would be a great way to do that. I did this in cooperation with Dr. Tarpey at NC State University. We're obviously doing some experiment on treatments that are not registered, approved treatments. So it was nice to have the involvement of NC State and Dr. Tarpey, and then I'm able to present it to anybody and anywhere. So just jump right in. Of course, this is a beautiful area that we all live in. So lucky, Southern Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. This is a nice fall picture. This is about now. And I won't get into some of these. I'm just going to skip through some of them. So this is a slide that I always like to include. And I'll include it at the end too, and I'll discuss it again. So this is a picture where Scott Davis, our club president in Buncombe County, took the mailing list of the Buncombe County Beekeepers. This is about 5 years ago. He took the mailing list and took the addresses of each of the people that were actually in our bee club, and he turned them into a blue dot. And just the middle part of this picture is Buncombe County. It doesn't even, because parts of this are Henderson County, obviously. So it shows that I live in a county with a lot of beekeepers. Henderson County is probably not a lot different. There's probably also a lot of beekeepers in Henderson, probably less than in Buncombe. We easily have over 100, maybe 200 beekeepers. We also have probably thousands of feral hives out in the woods. So it's an area that's saturated with beekeepers. That has several implications. First of all, we have a high mite pressure because obviously with that many beekeepers, some are treating their hives really well, some are not. Some are turning into mite bombs. So that's always a consideration, is we have a heavy mite pressure. Even if we're treating our hives well, we have a heavy pressure from other people's hives that we might be picking up mites from. It also makes it a hard area to do. Obviously, we'd like to get away from mite treatments and have bees that are more resistant genetically to mites. And in an area like this, it's difficult because we have all these other beekeepers and all these bees around us. I go buy, say, mite-resistant queens from a queen supplier. I could pick the best one in the country and do it, bring it to Buncombe County, my hive, it swarms or it supersedes the following year. The new queen is going to mate with whatever is out there. So it also makes it a difficult job. If you really wanted to breed mite-resistant bees or get your bees more pushed in that direction, you're a lot better off if you're up some isolated rural valley that maybe you only have a couple other beekeepers around you and you can work with them. You're going to be able to make progress a lot faster than where I am. I have not put a huge effort. Bob has actually put way more effort in the last 2 years into pushing his bees genetically in that direction than I have. And we'll get into that in some of the results later on. This is my basic hive. It's a deep and a medium. This is a wintertime shot. In the summer, of course, I have it supered up, but that's my basic year-round hive is a deep and a medium. Sometimes they can get flipped around where the deep is on the top, and in this case, the deep is on the bottom with the medium above it. There's a little bit, the insulation I do in the winter is just on the top. I use a piece of silver reflectix and a piece of blue board on top of the hive. The concept is called the condensing hive, If you're not familiar with that, I'm not going to get into it deeply, but I recommend you look into that. But that's how I manage them in the winter. Summertime, would look more like this. This is a honey flow about 3 years ago, where we had a very good early spring honey flow, and typically can have 4 and 5 supers on the hives in a better flow. So this is probably a shot, excuse me, in late May. And basic question, how many Varroa treatments per year are necessary to keep our hives healthy and productive? And this is, I won't get into this also as deeply, but basically the conclusion in most places that we've come to, if you don't have bees that are very genetically resistant to mites, we need about 3 treatments per year. We need 3 treatments scattered through a calendar year, each treatment roughly 90% effective in order to control the Varroa mites well. And Bob and I did a little experimenting here a couple years back, and we sort of skipped the one in the middle. We treated in December and August, and then pretty much arrived at the same conclusion that yes, we do need to treat them 3 times a year in some way. Generally speaking, this is what it would look like. You want your treatment to be spaced roughly 4 months apart, and so most people in here do oxalic vapor. Do people vaporize in December, use oxalic? Does anybody do the dribble? Pretty much everybody in this part of the country does the vapor. So the December oxalic vapor treatment does very well. I typically do it either 2 or 3 times. Bob, you do it similar, twice, and at least twice. I recommend doing it at least twice. I've also done that experiment where I put sticky boards under the hives in December, vaporized them once, waited a week or so, vaporized them a second time, saw what the mite drop was. And I really did pick up a significant number of mites on that second vaporization. So that first vaporization probably only hits about 90% of them, and then the second one cleans it up pretty well. And if you want to really be thorough, you can do a third one. It doesn't hurt the bees at all. On the third one, you'll only get a scattering of a few mites, but sometimes you do get a few. The vapor kills mites for about 1.5 to 2 days, and you can do that. And then, of course, if you look to August, most of us are familiar with August. I won't get into all the treatments, but typically it would be one of those, a thiamol-based treatment, a formic acid treatment, or amitraz. And then the harder one is the one in the middle. What are we going to use as our treatment in the middle? I won't get into each one has its own temperature limitations, or it might have limitations with the fact that honey supers are on the hive. Our blessing and our problem here is that we can make honey in May, June, and July. A lot of parts of the country, look at South Georgia, they make massive amounts of honey, but the honey flows over in early May. So we have a situation where we can make honey May, June, and July. Makes it difficult to treat for Varroa mites because we have that. And so some things you just can't use during that time. You can't use thiamol while they're making honey. It just will give a thiamol flavor to the honey. Obviously, you can't use amitraz because it's a chemical treatment. You can use formic acid pads. That is legal to do during a honey flow, so you can do that. And then lastly is this other idea. So from the beginning, we knew that oxalic was very effective as a vapor to kill Varroa mites. And so for the past 20, 25 years, people have been on a quest to figure out how to use oxalic acid in your hives in the middle of the summer with lots and lots of brood in the hive. Because in December, when you're hitting them with the vapor, there's no brood, or there's almost no brood in the hive. So the quest has been on for quite a while to come up with a way to use the oxalic to be able to treat in the summer. This was the first ones that cracked the code. It was a beekeeper and his chemist friend in Argentina, and they came up with this product. They figured out that you could mix oxalic acid with vegetable glycerin. You could then soak cardboard strips in that solution and put them in the hive, and came up with an effective mite treatment. It was done, this has been over 10 years, possibly 15 in Argentina. It's never been registered for sale in this country. The company that did it just chose to never do it. So we knew about it, but it was not registered here. Randy Oliver grabbed the ball and started to run with it. If you're familiar with Randy, he's a regular contributor to the American Bee Journal and also a lot on YouTube. And so he took the idea, he thought, okay, well, they're not going to register this Argentine strip, so we're going to start experimenting with it ourselves. And so he began experimenting with it. He tried it on blue shop towels. That didn't work very well. He then, a lot of his friends and contributors started to tell him different ways they were doing it. So people were experimenting around with it for 4 or 5 years. He put all the results of all those experiments in the Bee Journal. And you can go on his site. I encourage you, if you've never contributed to Randy, Randy is doing the best research in the country. In terms of applied research that's directly useful to beekeepers, there's no comparison to what Randy has done. And you can contribute, and every dollar that you give goes straight to more experiments that he has done like this. So he started it. People, as I said, gave him suggestions, and it kept going for 4 or 5 years. And then what they basically figured out from all these experiments and from using the Argentinian strips was the way this oxalic glycerin worked. It's a little hard to wrap your head around because you typically, when you think of a mite treatment, you want a mite treatment. You've got high mites in your hive, right? So you want to throw treatment in there and you want to knock the high mites down to low mites. That's the whole point of a mite treatment, right? Well, it turned out that this one works, but it works in a different way. So the way it works is, think about it as sort of a preventative. And if you put it in the hive when the hive has low mite levels, it basically keeps the mite levels low for as long as the treatment is in there. Normally what happens in the summer in a hive with all that brood, the mites climb all summer long. And also the virus is associated with the mites climb all summer long. And so this treatment, the way it works, is it basically flatlines the mites. And that's huge. But if you were to put it in August, with high mite levels in August and expect that it's going to work and knock the mite levels back to a low level, it just doesn't work that way. So that was the one very important thing that they worked out and figured out about this type of treatment. I'll skip that and that. And so this was 2023. 2022, I had experimented with it on a small scale. I put it in 20 or 30 hives and got some pretty promising results and was talking to Bob about it some at that point. And then 2023, I approached Dr. Tarpey and said, let's do this on a large scale. And he said, go. He said, great. And turns out NC State doesn't have a lot of hives to experiment with, so they're glad to have somebody do an experiment. And so we set up the experiment, and basically it was 2 bee yards. This is the first one. And this is the second one. And I won't go as deeply into what all we did. And you can also watch this on Bob's channel from last year when we talked quite extensively about it. But anyway, it was the 2 bee yards, 2 different locations. And I set it up in, basically these were the experimental groups. So I compared Formic Pro to oxalic glycerin. I'll show you a picture in a minute of what these look like. But we compared Formic Pro to oxalic glycerin applied in 2 different ways, which was 2 wider strips, which is number 2, and 4 narrower strips, which is number 3. It's the same amount of oxalic acid in number 2 and number 3. All I've done is cut the strips into narrower strips, and you'll see a picture in a minute. And then the 4th group was a control group of only 4 hives that were not treated. I was scared to death of control hives because basically what you're doing in an experiment, they like to see you do control hives, untreated hives. But also, untreated control hives can totally mess up an entire experiment because essentially they can turn into mite bombs. You're not treating them, right? So they're all full of mites. And then those mites can then spread to all your other hives that are sitting next to them. So doesn't that just totally mess up your experiment? It can. So I was a little bit worried about that, so I only did 4, which was kind of the minimum probably. The Formic Pro, I did 33 hives, and then the others were 16 and 18 hives. And these, again, were spread over 2 bee yards. So that was a large enough sample. And as you can see, one of the control hives did turn into a mite bomb. Actually, 2 of them did. And we did the pre-treatment mite counts right at the end of May. So all these, when I talk about a mite wash, my hives, Bob's hives, what we mean by that is a 300 bee sample. We used Dawn detergent mite wash, and the result, and actually these mite counts were a little bit high. This was at end of May, and my average mite count was about 2.4 on those. That was before I put the treatments in. So basically I put all the treatments in on May 30th or May 31st. So this is a picture of the Formic pads. The Formic Pro, I've learned early on with Formic. How many of you in here use Formic Pro at one time or another? Does anybody use 2 pads at once? Just the scattering. And only one time you will, and then you'll never do it again. In our part of the country, there seem to be problems with you. I won't say it's universal, but in our part of the country, there seem to be problems with using 2 pads at once. Using 2 pads at once is more effective. It will kill more mites, but it also kills queens. I did it on a small scale one year and killed about 20 to 30% of the queens of the hives that I put them in. Learned quickly that if you just put in, and if you look at the package instructions, it says you can do it either way. The 1 pad method is you put 1 pad in, and then 10 days later, you're supposed to take that pad out and put a 2nd pad in. I actually just put 1 pad in and then waited 10 days and put the 2nd one in and did not take the 1st one out. So that was only a slight deviation from the label. But anyway, that's how I did it. So that was the Formic pads. Here's the other ones. And this was what Randy Oliver and his friends had come up with as the best way to apply this to the hives. And it's these things called Swedish dishcloths, or they're called Swedish cellulose sponges. I just bought these on Amazon the first year. They're fairly cheap. They're under $1 a piece. They come in these crazy colors. The next year I'll eliminate the colors and get some white ones, but the first year we just did it with the colors. These have actually already been cut in half, so they're about 7 by 9 inches when you buy them. And they're just an absorbent cellulose cotton blend. They're highly absorbent and will hold a lot of solution. So that's what they look like. And we use, this is the legal form of the oxalic acid. The AP bioxal is that form. And there's now a second legal form since I did this slideshow, which of course is this Easy Ox is the other form. So there's now 2 legal forms of that. This was the vegetable glycerin. Just bought a 5-gallon bucket of vegetable grade glycerin. And here's the pad. So this is the version where it's the 2 wide pieces on the hive, and I've lifted up the medium, and so basically this is going in the middle of the brood nest between the deep box and the medium box. And this is the 2 wider pads, and then this is where I've then cut those pads in half again long ways for narrower strips. So we wanted to compare. That was the 3 groups, the Formic pads versus these 2 different ways of cutting the sponge strips. And post-treatment, so these were in for 75 days. Took them out about August 14th and 15th. So I went all the way through 2 honey flows and did it 75 days. And then we washed all the hives again. We did a mite sample of all those hives, just like we had done at the beginning. After 75 days, it varies what they look like. Most of them just look like this, where they're sort of dirty and have propolis on them, but the bees don't particularly do a very good job of removing them. If you touch your finger to the pad and taste it, you can still taste oxalic acid in the pads. There's still quite a bit in the pads at the end of 75 days. Sometimes they do a little better job of chewing them out, like this picture on. They start to remove it. This particular pad that we got had this mesh in the middle of it. So that's what it looked like. And then here's again, these have been in there 75 days, have not been chewed out very much. These have been chewed out more. And then people ask me when they saw these pictures, they said, oh, wait a minute, it looks like they're chewing the blue ones out faster. It's just the randomness of the pictures that I took, that the 2 on the slideshow look like that. But no, it didn't seem to matter what color. But then the next year we decided to get some white ones instead of doing the colored ones. That's what it looked like. My favorite little tool for handling any kind of strip are these little hemostats or fishing pliers. They're really nice. I like to work without gloves, and that way I made these strips at home, put them in a tub, and I could just handle them with the hemostats instead of with my hands or my fingers. There's the basic kit. It's up here. Feel free to come up later. I can show you. I actually did the samples where I took them home instead of doing them in the field because I was afraid that, first of all, I was going to get some large samples that had a lot of mites in them. And I really needed accurate counts of the mites for this experiment, so I took that, and I'll be glad to show you. If you come up here later, you can look at these and I'll show you how we did it. But that's my equipment for doing that. I took them home in Ziploc bags like that with numbers on them, splashed a little bit of the solution in the bag, put the bees in there, and brought them home. This is us in my kitchen, myself, my son, and Lewis Cobble, who's our bee inspector for Western North Carolina. So we did it in the kitchen for all those samples. And I used this bucket with a white paint strainer bag on top as the way to do it. And I really like to do that because it makes the mites really visible. So this is an example of one of the samples that I put over the mesh bag and washed it. And you can see how easy it's very easy to separate the mites. There's pieces of trash in there that look almost like mites, but you can easily distinguish them when you have them on top of this. So here's the results from a couple years ago, and this was it. In the control hives, yes, they turned into mite bombs. The one worst one in the control hives had 155 mites in it. Lewis said it was the highest mite count he'd ever seen on a hive anywhere in his experience. And he's the bee inspector, so he sees a lot of beehives. So one of them was 155. There was another one that was something like 70. The Formic Pro, this is the first yard of the 2 yards. Formic Pro came in at 18, which the threshold again is 9. Formic Pro is 18, the 2-piece was 13, and the 4-piece was the best. It was down to 7. This is the second yard. The Formic Pro did a little better in this yard. It was 10, and the 2-piece glycerin was 13, and the 4-piece again worked the best. It was 4. So here it is if you combine them into one graph. Control, the Formic Pro and the oxalic glycerin 2-piece were almost equal, and then the oxalic glycerin 4-piece is 5. So obviously the 4-piece strip worked the best. It was down there at 5. Here it is graphed on a graph where it's a little easier to see along with standard deviation. And you can see the oxalic 4-piece worked the best of the 4. Why does it work the best? Probably just because it's 4 strips. The bees can get up and around them a little better. They're getting probably more exposure to the oxalic acid, I would guess. Here's the median, which also tells you that roughly it's the same result, that the 4-piece works the best. And the percent of hives that were over the threshold, this is also important. If you'll notice, the oxalic glycerin 4-piece is clearly the best. Only 11% of them were over threshold, and the other ones were higher. On to last year. So this will be 2024, and we switched to the white strips. Bob and I obtained some of these white strips that are they're very similar material, and we decided that would eliminate the whole issue of the color of the strips. And this time I did it. I did 31 hives in 7 different locations, so it's spread out over more bee yards. I left the treatments in a little bit longer. They were in for 90 days, and I got an average ending mite count of 4.25. So all I was doing was essentially, I just did these strips only. I didn't do the Formic Pro. I didn't do the wide strips. All I was doing was switching to the white strips, doing it a second year, doing it across 7 different bee yards instead of just 2, and wanted to see if I got a similar result. So I got almost exactly the same result. Remember back here, the oxalic glycerin 4-piece was an average of 5, and then back to here, it's 4.25. So it's almost exactly the result I got from the year before. So that's pretty encouraging. And then part of it, the reason last year that I did it, we were hoping this Viroxan would come out. It's the new strip. It's the same idea. It's taking the oxalic and the glycerin and putting it in a strip. only now we had a legal registered strip that we could buy and use. And it's very similar to the ones from Argentina. They look like that, a little cardboard strip. And we were hoping last year, 2024, to have them in time to do the experiment. They didn't come out and get registered till September. So we were unable to experiment with them at all last year. So that's why I just did this experiment again with the sponges only. Then they did come out finally in September, so that allowed us to be able to use them this year. So there's the packaging of it, and I won't go into the label, but it has very clear instructions on what to put in. It said on the package, 1 strip per 2.5 frames of bees. Now that's a little vague, and I've talked to a couple of representatives from the company and gotten a couple of different answers. And essentially, one answer I did get was that it's best if the strip is directly in contact with brood. So if you put them in a honey super or a box that contained almost totally honey, it will be less effective than if the strip was directly in contact with brood. So it's helpful to look in the hive and see where the brood nest is, especially if it's a little bit to one side or the other. And I had one person that worked for the company told me, you should never put more, there's no reason to put any more than 4 strips in a hive. Now, I've heard other people tell me that might not be true, that we might want to put more than 4 strips in a hive. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. But when we set up the experiment this year, Bob and I basically set it up the same way. We decided to test the Viroxan, the new Viroxan, versus our experimental strips from before, the Swedish sponges. And then further, we had a friend from Canada who we met at bee meetings, Barry, and he's developing another strip to compete. Essentially, the idea, it's a very similar strip to the Viroxan. So in this picture, the new legal Viroxan is the one on the left. The experimental Canadian strips are the ones on the right. They're a little thinner, they're a little wider, they feel a little different. I have both of them up here. You're free to come look at them afterwards. But so we decided to do a 3-way test where we do the Viroxan versus the sponge strips from before versus these new Canadian strips. These Canadian strips are not registered in this country or in Canada. He's still at the point where he's developing it and has not gotten a registration anywhere. So hopefully by our experiments we'll actually help him along in the process of trying to do that. The difference between the strips, there is a difference. So the Viroxan strips contain about 7 grams of oxalic per strip. Our sponge strips contain anywhere from 12.5 to 13 per strip, so quite a bit more. And then the Canadian strips contain about 12. So the Viroxan has the least per strip, and our sponges have the most per strip. But we decided we're just going to put 4 strips of all these. Bob did it further where he did an experiment where he laid them across the top of the frames like this, and as well as putting them down between the frames. If you read the label on the Viroxan, you're supposed to put the strips down between the frames. I only did it that way. I did not do it across the top bars. So this was 2025, and I did it all across my operation. I did hives, one of the 3 different ways of treating it. I only did 10 hives with the Canadian strips. I actually wished I had done more. I did over 100 of each of the other 2, of the Viroxan and our little white sponge strips. I did over 100. So I did a lot. So if I had to do it again, I would do a few more of the Canadian ones. And then when I went to sample, I sampled 87 different hives, so it was by far the largest number of samples I'd ever done. It didn't match Bob and Selena's 800 plus, but I did manage to sample about 87. And I did it over 8 different locations. The starting mite counts back in May, I did not do extensive starting mite counts across all these hives. I just did a small sampling all through, and again, I found the mite levels were low. Also, the treatment stayed in a little bit longer. I did a 90-day treatment, and I wanted to see at the end of 90 days. The Viroxan label, I believe, says 42 to 56 days. So it was definitely longer than that, but I didn't sample until the 90-day point. So that's what it was. And there's the results from 2025. The Verox, and again, this is a 300B mite wash. I sampled it. The Veroxan came in at 16.5, which is, again, the threshold is 9. The Canadian strips came in at 4.6. The oxalic glycerin four pieces came in at 4.1. And I'll get to Scott at the bottom in a minute. So again, if you look at this, the 4.1 is extremely close to the same result I had the last 2 years. I had 5, and then I had 4.25, and then I had 4.1. So these oxalic glycerin sponges have been extremely consistent across 3 years. The result has been almost the same. Again, if you get into what's the amount of oxalic acid that's in each of these, on the Veroxan strips, it would have been only 28 grams of oxalic total. The Canadian strips would have been 48 grams of oxalic, and the oxalic glycerin sponge strips are anywhere from 50 to 55. So it's exactly in the order as you'd expect. And it seems to be dependent on how much oxalic that you're putting in there. And I think to do a fair test, what I would do, if I was to repeat this next year, and I think I will on a smaller scale, I'll look at it. You would put 7 or 8 strips of the Veroxan in the hive versus 4 or 5 of the Canadian strips versus 4 of the sponge strips. Then you would be essentially the same amount of oxalic in all cases, and then run that and see how many mites you get. I think that would be a nice experiment. Hopefully we'll do that next year and see that. What was interesting was, but I don't want to criticize Veroxan. I think it's a great new product. I've talked to a lot of people that are having good luck with it, and so I don't want these numbers to represent that I'm saying Veroxan doesn't work. I think it's a work in progress, and we have to figure out how to use it. My hives were, a deep and a medium and 3 to 5 honey supers stacked on top of them. So then you wonder, okay, is the 4 strips of Veroxan just not enough? Maybe I should have had 6 or 7 strips in there. But then I started talking to other people that had used the Veroxan, and they were getting much lower numbers. Chad, for our club yard, you got much lower numbers, is that right?
Generally, yeah.
So what was your sort of mite count?
Most of the hives were around 2. We had a couple high ones in the 6s or 7s, but the vast majority were 1 or 2.
So average was probably 3 or 4, would you say? So that was lower. So that was low. I've talked to other people that had got lower numbers than I did. And then I talked to my friend Scott, and he did it, and he got his average from the Veroxan was 3.2, which was way lower. And so then I dug a little deeper into that and talked to him about that, what he had done. I have here on the chart that he used 4 strips, but that's actually not quite true. First of all, he's got 8 frame equipment. His hives are smaller. They're smaller and narrower. He doesn't manage them as intensively as I do. He doesn't super them as heavily as I do. I would guess the hives had half the number of bees in them that mine had in them. And then I said, well, how many strips did you put on? And he said it varied. He said if it was a nuke, I might have put on 2 Veroxan strips or 3. And he said my very strongest hives I put 5 and 6 on. So they're smaller to begin with. And then on his bigger hives, he put 5 or 6 strips. And so then that to me, and he said, and also we'd been through the hurricane last year. He said the hives were a little weaker. They took longer to build up into the summer. So he got significantly better results than I did. So that was interesting. I don't know quite the answer to that, but I think that comes close. I think they work. I think that the point too is that we need to test. As with any treatment, if you use it, don't just trust completely that it works. Test it for yourself and see. There again is graphed out on a graph. You can see the average mite counts. And then on to Bob. And Bob is here with us. And I summarized his results into just a couple slides, and we'll talk about them for a couple minutes, and he's free to contribute too. But he did it also where he did it both where he put it across the top of the combs and he hung it vertically. and you can see his and then so that pretty much has it all. And you can see the first thing when you look at his numbers are significantly lower than mine. They're very much lower to start with. His highest numbers are still lower than my lowest numbers. So why is that? We've discussed it a little bit. I think there's 2 or 3 things going on. First of all, Bob has put more effort into genetically resistant to mites bees. He just has. He's bought hundreds and hundreds of queens from known sources that have some mite resistance. He's pushed. I've done that to a small degree, but I haven't done it as hard as I am. He also lives in a more rural. Most of his bee yards are in a more rural area with fewer other beekeepers. He's obviously got feral colonies all scattered through the woods, just like I do. But he's probably got fewer hobby beekeepers in the area, would you guess, than what I have in Buncombe County. So that has something to do with it. He also, a lot of your business is making nukes. And in the springtime, he's taking his hives, he's heavily splitting them. You're getting 1 to 2 nukes out of almost every hive. Yeah, so right from there, he's splitting his hive in half, selling half. He's selling half the bees to someone else, and you're also taking half the mites away. Of course, the mites are very low that time of year, but still that could contribute to it. So I think it's kind of a combination of those 3 things. What I would guess why your numbers are so much lower than mine. Do you have any other?
No, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, I think it's those 3 in general. You can see, and also watch his video on his channel from last week. He talks with Lewis Bartlett at length about all this, but you can see a similar trend. The oxalic glycerin sponge strips are still the lowest count, down at 0.9, and the viroxan is the highest count, which is at 2.8. And then the other ones are kind of intermediate. They obviously, the viroxan and the Canadian strips work better if they're hung down between the frames than they do if they're put across the top of the frames. But otherwise, his numbers are pretty similar, but just low across the board there. And there was also a difference in the hives in terms of how the hives handled these strips. And especially what we were interested in was ease of putting them in, ease of removing them. And what you found out was these Canadian strips, the bees, they were thinner, and the bees chewed them out better. So all the hives that I saw, that I only had 10 that had the Canadian strips, they completely chewed the strip out, and the only piece left was the little piece across the top bar. So they removed them and were done, and you didn't have to deal with it. The viroxan strips, they only kind of halfway chewed them out. There were pieces still left vertically hanging, so they did not remove those as well. The sponge strips, as you saw earlier, they don't remove those particularly well. But they're fairly easy to scrape off. They're across the top bars of your hive, and so they're fairly easy to scrape off with a hive tool, so that's not as much of an issue. So there was a difference between those in terms of that, where the rate of removal and that sort of thing. What else did we not cover? Oh, also what we did not test in all this is we did not test what these would do in August and September. All we've tested is, again, we started with hives with low mite levels and it kept them low. So nowhere in this experiment did we test this idea because I believe viroxan company still claims that they will take a high mite level and reduce it to a lower level. And we simply don't know that. We did not determine. Hopefully through your videos, you're going to get a lot of comments. And
I recommend that you get a bunch of hives next year that are loaded with mites and give it a try.
I want you to do that. And, you know, the past experience with every other form of this oxalic glycerin is they don't work that way. And so I won't say one way or the other, but yeah, that's yet to be determined whether that could work or not. And so I'll go back again to that, my slide again, where I live in a county with a lot of beekeepers, so it would be very difficult for me to get to the point and look at it. This is the way I kind of look at it now, and I'll go back to Bob's actually quickly. So the one thing we didn't talk about was, and that you and Lewis did talk about extensively, is the genetics. The genetics, and he showed it really well, the genetics of the bees were more powerful at keeping the mites low than the treatments were. It was very clear. And the treatments are great, but if you can actually get those genetics into your hives, that's an actually more powerful tool at controlling the mites than the treatments are. Would you agree?
The video that's coming out tomorrow morning shows the queen comparison, and it shows exactly that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a really takeaway, or just to summarize it very simply, effective Varroa control, it's like you've got two baskets. You've got mite treatments or you've got mite-resistant genetics. So the more you can get out of that basket with the mite-resistant genetics, the less you have to do with the treatments. Realistically, I live in an area where I'm planning to continue treatments. It's also a matter of testing and how much testing you're willing to do. Bob has tested, almost every hive to see what the mite levels are, and I have not. So the more you're willing to incorporate those genetics, and also the more you're willing to just test, you will find out. You'll find out if it's working or not, if it's keeping the mites under control or not. So, and examples of Varroa resistant stock, I just threw a few up there. There's a lot out there, and it's happening more and more. You're using several different stocks from several different sources. And this is not all inclusive. This is just some examples of stuff that's being used. The VSH pole line comes from USDA Baton Rouge lab. Many people are familiar with Stevens Bee Company, Corey Stevens in Missouri. He lives in a very isolated area with not a lot of other beekeepers around him. He's done some amazing work with breeding the genetics of it. My friend Ryan Williamson, he's in Central Virginia. He's also doing just some amazing work where he's been breeding queens and getting really high levels of resistance. He's doing extensive Harbo testing on his colonies. He and Corey, both the Stevens and Ryan Williamson, they sell virgin queens, and they ship virgin queens, and you buy them, and there's a whole process for introducing virgin queens. So their business has been kind of focused on that. The Golden West queens, which you used a lot of this year, I believe, several hundred. And those are the stock that Randy Oliver has developed in California, and then Ray Oliveras is doing the breeding and distribution work. Feral swarms and cutouts. All over the world, feral colonies, feral populations of bees are slowly building up, and they're getting more and more resistance to the mites. Even in areas with a lot of beekeepers, if you can trap feral colonies or feral swarms, there's possibly some good genetics that you can work with. There's, of course, then again, you have to do testing if you want to know where you're getting mite wash testing, Harbo testing, UBO testing, and some of the other. And again, relative isolation from other beekeepers is also helpful if you're trying to get to a place where you're more resistant. And so back again to the 3 treatments per year, that's kind of how it would lay out if you're going to use this oxalic glycerin technology. It would be in the middle there in May. That's about when you put them in. I think Bob was middle of May, pretty similar. Yeah, so that's where it would work. And then I mostly rely on the thymol in August. And I will mention also at least one and possibly 2 or 3 different people or companies are working on a form of these strips, the sponge strips. I know Mike Art in Ohio who markets the Easy Ox. He is experimenting right now on a method of doing this, and he's trying to get registration for that. And there's probably 1 or 2, I've heard there are 1 or 2 other companies that are also playing with that and trying to get registration. So, yes.
On your 2020 over and over, what are your feelings on that?
So, in general, what's happened, I've been this from the beginning. I had bees before Varroa mites like Bob did. And so I've seen every treatment. We've been through all of it. And interestingly, Europe got the Varroa mites 10 to 15 years before we did. And so almost every treatment, with the exception of the hop guard, all the treatments were worked out by the Europeans. We actually have them to thank because they've done all this well ahead of us. They screened 500 different natural substances to see which ones could kill Varroa mites, and they narrowed it down to 4. They've done all this work. Then as the synthetic chemical treatments for mites came out one after another, we've had those too, and essentially we've had 3 different ones. We've had 3 different synthetic chemicals that we've used in the hives. And they've all failed. They're all 3 failed. The Amitraz was the last one, and it was the longest. It worked for over 30 years, and it just failed. So basically, all the synthetics are gone. It's possible we could rotate them back in, but at this point, none of them seem to be working very well. On the natural substances, which have been used in Europe for 40 years now, the thymol, the formic acid, and the oxalic acid being the main 3. Those are the 3 we use in this country. They're all naturally occurring. They're in your food. They're in the environment. They've been using them in Europe all that time. Nowhere, anywhere have the mites shown any ability to develop any resistance to the natural substances. Why that is, not quite clear. You know, their mode of action is more general and not probably as specific. And people said it's like hitting you on the head with a hammer. There's no way you can become resistant to it. But don't rule it out. It's possible. It's possible that the bees could develop resistance to one of the natural substances. I think the experiment, the one thing to take away, it's still worth rotation. It really is. So I know in New Zealand and several places, and even people that I've talked to at bee meetings, they've said, I'm doing nothing but oxalic acid all year long. I'm doing either the vapor or I'm doing the pads or whatever, nothing but oxalic all year long. And I'm going, bad idea. Not a good idea. At some point in there, you need to rotate to something else. So like in this case, I'm doing the oxalic, and then the oxalic, and then I'm rotating to the thymol, and then back to the oxalic. So just the act of rotating to something else once a year, I think is still important to do that. Right now, they're all still working, but who knows what the future holds. You know, again, the genetics are the future, but for now, yeah, rotate, do different. Anybody else? Question? Okay, good deal.
Thank you, Greg.
You bet.